What does it take to make a professional killer lose his mind? Not fear of the law, not guilt. Something far worse. Something that shouldn't exist. May 30th, 1431. A public square in northern France. The executioner had done his job. He'd lit the fire 3 times over. He'd used enough accelerant to reduce iron to liquid. The crowd had dispersed. The English commanders were satisfied. But the executioner wasn't celebrating. He was on his knees in the smoking debris, clawing through the black ash with trembling hands. Because something was wrong. There, sitting in the center of the destruction, was the prisoner's heart. Whole, red, filled with blood, untouched by the inferno that had consumed everything else. The man who killed strangers for coins was now staring at proof that something beyond his understanding had just occurred. He didn't wait for explanations. He stuffed the organ into a sack, sprinted to the nearest bridge, and hurled it into the current below. He would later confess that he was certain he had murdered someone holy. But his English employers, they couldn't care less about his spiritual crisis. They had bigger problems. They needed this teenage prisoner erased from existence, not just dead. Gone, as if she'd never drawn breath. Now pause for a moment. Empires don't tremble at the mention of peasant girls. Generals don't strategize around illiterate teenagers. Yet here was the mightiest military force in medieval Europe, desperately trying to erase every trace of a farmer's daughter from a village nobody had heard of. That level of institutional panic demands an explanation, and the explanation is this: she broke their world. To understand how one girl could dismantle an empire's confidence, you need to see the wasteland she walked out of. Forget everything the paintings told you. The France of the early 1400s wasn't castles and tournaments, but it was a mass grave. The conflict with England had been grinding flesh and bone for 3 generations. The countryside had been picked clean by roving armies from both sides. Wolves had grown so bold they were wandering into Paris itself, dragging bodies from shallow burials. The man wearing the crown, Charles VI, had completely lost his grip on reality. He suffered from episodes where he forgot his own identity. He believed, with total conviction, that his body was made of glass and that physical contact would shatter him into pieces. He had metal rods sewn into his clothing to protect himself from imaginary destruction, a glass king on a crumbling throne. And the nobility? Did they rally to protect the realm? They tore each other's throats out instead. 2 factions emerged from the chaos. One supported the royal bloodline, the other sold their loyalty to the English invaders. This wasn't political disagreement. This was generational blood feud. One of the faction leaders was murdered during what was supposed to be a peace negotiation, hacked to death on a bridge while kneeling. His son, consumed by vengeance, made a decision that should have ended French independence forever. He handed the keys of the kingdom to England. The treaty that followed was essentially a death certificate for France. The Mad King signed it, probably unaware of what his pen was doing. It declared that the French crown would pass not to the king's own son, but to the English monarch. The rightful heir was declared illegitimate, stripped of succession, and cast out. On paper, France ceased to exist as an independent nation. It was just an English province waiting for the current occupant to die. Into this nightmare, on the far eastern edge of the dying kingdom, a girl stopped playing in her father's garden. She was 13 years old. She went very still. She tilted her head toward the church, and she listened to something no one else could hear. What happened next defies rational explanation, and honestly, it doesn't matter whether you believe she heard divine voices or suffered from some unexplained neurological condition. What matters is what she did with what she heard. The visitations continued for years. At first, they were simple instructions. Be good. Go to church. But as she grew older, the messages escalated. They became political. They became military. By the time she was 16, the commands were specific and impossible. Leave your village, find the local military commander, demand an escort to the disinherited prince, get him crowned as king, then drive the English out of your country. Consider the absurdity. In this era, a peasant girl couldn't leave her home without her father's permission. She'd never sat on a war horse. She'd never held a weapon. She didn't understand basic military terminology. Yet she was being told to lead armies. She argued with the voices. She told them she was just a poor girl who knew nothing of war. The response was simple. It is not you who will do this. It is God who commands it. So she went. She convinced her uncle to take her to the nearest garrison town. She walked into the commander's office wearing a red dress and announced that heaven had sent her to save the kingdom. The commander's reaction was predictable. He laughed in her face. He told her uncle to take her home and discipline her properly, but she didn't leave. She stayed in town. She went to mass every day. She talked to anyone who would listen. Her certainty was contagious. Within weeks, 2 minor knights had become believers. They asked her what would happen to the kingdom if no one acted. She looked them in the eyes and said something that sealed her fate. There is no one in the world who can recover this kingdom except me. The commander eventually gave in. So not because he believed her, because public opinion was shifting and he wanted the problem out of his hands. He gave her a sword, a small escort, and sent her toward the prince with what amounted to a shrug. Go, he said, let whatever happens, happen. Before leaving, she made 2 choices that would later be used against her. She cut her hair short. And she put on men's clothing. This wasn't vanity, it was survival. She had to ride 350 miles through enemy territory. A teenage girl in a dress, surrounded by soldiers, was guaranteed to suffer violence. Male clothing was practical armor against assault. They traveled at night. They wrapped their horses' hooves in cloth to muffle the sound. They slept on frozen ground. Her escorts later admitted they considered killing her in a quarry and saving themselves the trouble of the whole mission. But something about her endurance stopped them. She never complained. She never slowed down. When she finally reached the royal court, the prince decided to test her. He hid himself among his courtiers and placed someone else on the throne as a decoy. She had never seen him in her life. She had never seen any royalty. The doors opened. She walked in. She ignored the man on the throne completely. She walked straight to the real prince hiding in the corner, knelt before him, and greeted him as king. The prince pointed to the decoy. That's the king over there, he said. She didn't blink. In the name of God, she replied, it is you and no other. Still not convinced, the prince took her aside for a private conversation. Nobody knows what was said, but witnesses saw his expression transform from skepticism to something approaching wonder. The leading theory is that she revealed the contents of a secret prayer he had made alone, asking God for a sign that he was the legitimate heir. After weeks of theological interrogation and invasive physical examinations to prove she wasn't carrying demonic corruption, the court ran out of excuses. The illiterate teenager was given command of the army. She was given white armor, a painted banner, and marched toward the besieged city that would make her legend. The English had been strangling that city for 6 months. They had surrounded it with fortified positions and were starving the population into submission. The French commanders planned to use this strange girl as a mascot, a morale booster. They would do the real fighting while she waved her flag. They underestimated her badly. Her first act was dictating a letter to the English king. It wasn't diplomatic. It was a threat. "Surrender your cities," she wrote, "or I will make a war cry that echoes through eternity." The English responded by calling her names and promising to burn her when they caught her. The French generals wanted patience. What was strategy? Waiting for reinforcements. She wanted violence. She woke up from a nap, furious that a skirmish had started without her, and rushed to the walls herself. Her approach to warfare was brutal and modern. Find the enemy, close the distance, hit them until they stop moving. On May the 7th, against the objections of every professional soldier, she led a direct assault on the fortified gatehouse controlling the main bridge. It was supposed to be impossible. As she was scaling the walls, an English archer spotted the white armor. His arrow found its mark. It punched through metal and flesh, burying itself in her shoulder just above her chest. She fell into the ditch. The English cheered. The French morale collapsed. The commanders ordered retreat. But in the field hospital, something unexpected happened. She had the arrow torn out. Some accounts say she pulled it out herself. She slapped a compress on the wound. She confessed her sins, and then she put her armor back on. The retreating French soldiers saw her banner rising again. She rode back to the battle line covered in her own blood. The sight shattered something in the English defenders. They stopped fighting a human enemy and started fighting something they couldn't understand. Panic spread. Their commander tried to flee across a wooden bridge. The structure collapsed under the weight of terrified men in plate armor. He drowned in the river, dragged down by his own protection. The siege that had lasted 6 months was broken in 3 days by a wounded teenager. What followed was a lightning campaign that rewrote the rules of the war. For decades, the English had been the hunters. Now they were running. City after city fell. At one battle, the French cavalry caught the feared English archers before they could plant their defensive stakes. It wasn't combat, it was slaughter. 2,000 English dead, 3 French casualties. Then came the impossible march. Deep into enemy territory, toward the cathedral where French kings had been crowned for generations. The generals called it suicide. She overruled them. As the royal army approached, hostile cities simply opened their gates. They weren't surrendering to the prince, they were surrendering to her legend. The coronation happened exactly as she had promised. The disinherited fugitive received the holy oil. The crown touched his head. He was no longer a pretender, he was king. And at that exact moment, standing at the altar beside him, she became expendable. The king had what he wanted, legitimacy. What he didn't want was an uncontrollable teenage mystic who was more popular than he was. The politicians wanted to negotiate. She wanted to push forward and finish the enemy. They saw her as a liability now. The funding dried up. Secret truces were signed behind her back. When she attacked the capital, she was wounded again, shot through the thigh. She screamed from the mud for hours, urging the soldiers forward. But this time, the order came from the king himself. Retreat. And to ensure she couldn't disobey, he had the bridge to the city destroyed behind her. They gave her empty honors, noble titles for her family, expensive clothes. It was a golden cage. They were trying to retire her, turn her into a symbol to be displayed at banquets rather than a general commanding troops. But she wasn't built for peace. Or when the enemy moved again in the spring, she didn't wait for permission. She rode out with a handful of volunteers to defend a strategic town. The king didn't try to stop her. Some historians believe he was relieved. The end came outside those walls. She was leading a rear guard action, covering her retreating soldiers. She expected the city gates to stay open for her. They didn't. The drawbridge rose. The portcullis slammed down. She was trapped outside with the enemy closing in. They dragged her off her horse. They stripped her weapons. There was no divine intervention, no angelic rescue, just mud and rough hands and the screaming of soldiers. She waited months for ransom, the standard procedure for a valuable prisoner. She waited for the king she had crowned to pay for her freedom. He did nothing. Not a single coin offered, not a single threat made. Complete silence. The English paid instead. A king's ransom. Enough money to equip a small army. She was bought and sold like valuable livestock. The trial that followed was theatre designed to destroy her. 70 theologians and lawyers on high benches. One 19-year-old prisoner on a wooden stool. No lawyer, no witnesses, no defense allowed. They tried for months to trap her with theological puzzles, and then they asked the question designed to be impossible. Do you know if you are in God's grace? According to church doctrine, no human could know that answer. If she said yes, she was a heretic claiming divine knowledge. If she said no, she was confessing to sin. She looked at them and answered, "If I am not, may God put me there. If I am, may God keep me there." The court went silent. The scribes stopped writing. She had sidestepped the trap with precision that professional theologians couldn't match. Since they couldn't defeat her intellectually, they broke her physically. They kept her chained in darkness. They denied her religious sacraments. They showed her torture instruments. They isolated her until she was sick, exhausted, and terrified. Finally, they cornered her on something absurd: her clothing. The Bible forbids women from wearing men's attire. She refused to change because her male clothing, with its many laces and tight fit, was her only protection against the guards who groped her constantly. They offered her a choice: confess and wear a dress, or burn. Facing the executioner and the screaming crowd, sick and exhausted, she broke. She signed a confession. She couldn't read. She agreed to wear a dress. She was sentenced to life imprisonment. 3 days later, she was wearing men's clothing again. Some accounts say the guards stole her dress, leaving her nothing else. Others say she chose to put the clothes back on as protection. But her own words tell a different story. She looked at her captors and retracted everything. "I damned myself to save my life," she said. How she understood that denying her truth was worse than any fire. The bishop rushed from her cell, shouting to the English, "It is done." By returning to male clothing, she was technically a relapsed heretic. The punishment was automatic death. They built the pyre unusually high so the executioner couldn't reach her to offer the customary mercy of a quick death by strangulation. They wanted her to feel every moment. As she climbed toward the flames, she asked for a cross. An English soldier, unmoved despite himself, broke a stick and tied it together for her. She pressed it against her skin. When the fire took her, she didn't scream curses. She screamed one word over and over through the smoke: Jesus. She was 19 years old. 25 years later, with the war won and the English driven out, the king she had crowned ordered a retrial, not to honor her memory, to clean up his own reputation. He'd been crowned by a condemned witch, after all. The original verdict was declared corrupt and void. She was called a martyr. The bishop who condemned her was declared a heretic himself. Centuries later, the church made her a saint. But strip away the halo and the statues, and you find something more powerful than religious symbolism. You find a girl who looked at a broken world and decided she could fix it. She didn't wait for permission. She didn't wait for someone more qualified. In a world that constantly tells people they're too small, too young, too powerless to change anything, her story offers a terrifying and beautiful counter-argument. Conviction, when pure enough, can bend reality. They burned her to make the world forget. Instead, they made her immortal. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment below and tell me, do you think she was guided by something beyond human understanding? Or was she a product of impossible circumstances? Forged into something extraordinary by the pressure of her time?